You think the ocean today is scary, but 500 million years ago, if you went swimming, you'd basically be entering a horror movie where each creature looked like it was designed by someone who really didn't like you. And the deeper you went, the more creepy they got. These creatures are what were lurking in the depths of the prehistoric oceans. And honestly, I regret researching some of them with how scary they actually are. So we're starting our journey into prehistoric hell with something called Opabinia regalis. And right away, you know this thing was trouble because scientists took one look at it and basically said, what the actual hell is this supposed to be? When the guy who first presented this fossil showed it to a room full of paleontologists, they literally laughed at him. Not because it was funny, but because their brains just couldn't process what they were seeing. Picture a 7-centimeter worm, which sounds harmless until you realize it has 5 eyes. 5, not 2 like a normal creature, not even 4 for some weird creatures, but 5. All sticking out of its head on little stalks, giving it 360 view of everything around it. But why did it need to see everything? Because it was hunting. Yes, this thing was a predator. This thing had a vacuum cleaner hose for a mouth that was 1/3 of its body length, claw at the end that had 5 sharp spines. So basically, it would cruise around the muddy seafloor 500 million years ago, using its ridiculous eye setup to spot prey, then shoot out this nightmare tube to grab whatever looked tasty. And here's the thing that gets me. This was living in what scientists call the shallow part of the ocean, the cathedral escarpment area about 200 meters down where sunlight was already getting pretty sketchy. This 5-eyed vacuum monster was the shallow water crowd. You really have to wonder what kind of fresh hell was waiting in the deeper parts. Trust me, we're gonna get there. It gets much worse. The fact that evolution decided, yeah, 5 eyes and a grabby straw mouth, that's the move, tells you everything about how competitive and brutal life was down there in the abyss. This is the fearsome Korgosaurus Rex. His name is Flapjack. And if you don't like and subscribe, he literally is going to eat you. Look at his face. This is a fearsome apex predator from the prehistoric period. You don't want to mess with him. Meet Hallucigenia sparsa, a name that basically means dreamlike, which is the kind of dream you would have after eating gas station sushi at 2 a.m. This little guy was only about 5 centimeters long, and you might think, oh, that's not so bad. Dead wrong, because what Hallucigenia lacked in size, it made up for in pure nope factor. It had 7 pairs of sharp spines sticking straight up from its back, each one perfectly designed to make any predator think twice about lunch plans. Nope. But here's my favorite part about this creature. When scientists first found it, they had no idea which end was up. For years, they had it displayed upside down, thinking it walked on its spines and used its legs as some kind of feeding tentacles. It took them decades to figure out they've been looking at this thing completely backwards. Imagine being such a weird creature that paleontologists can't even tell if you're right side up. Hallucigenia was basically a walking pincushion that spent its days munching on sponges and organic garbage on the seafloor. It's not exactly apex predator material, but in a world where things with 5 eyes and grabby mouth straws were cruising around, being covered in spikes is apparently the smart play. The really fun part is that this spiky nightmare was sharing the same neighborhood as Opabinia, the same deep dark basin, the same muddy bottom. Just 2 completely different approaches to not getting eaten. One went with the see everything and grab it first strategy, another chose become absolutely miserable to swallow. Both strategies worked, which should tell you something about how genuinely unpleasant it was to be alive back then. Of course though, some creatures decided spikes wouldn't be enough. Leanchoilia took one look at the whole defense through spikes approach and said, nah, I'm gonna go with whips. Not regular arms, mind you, whips. 3 long, flexible whip arms that could feel around in the dark water for anything that moved. This 5-centimeter hunter had figured out something the other guys hadn't. Down at 50 to 150 meters deep, light was becoming a real problem. Your fancy 5 eyes don't help much when there's barely anything to see. So Leanchoilia developed these ridiculous feeler arms that could probe around in the mud and sense vibrations from worms trying to hide. The whole setup was honestly pretty clever. It also had 2 stalked eyes that could peek out from under its head shield. But the real action was happening with those whip appendages. Touch something that felt meaty, grab it. Feel something wiggling in the sediment, that's dinner. Scientists found this thing all over the place. Canada, China, Morocco. Apparently, the I have whip arms and I'm not afraid to use them lifestyle was working out pretty well across different oceans across the world, which makes sense when you think about it. While everyone else was busy evolving bigger eyes or sharper spikes, Leanchoilia went with the just feel around until you find food approach. The downside to being a small creature with weird arms in a world full of shell crushers and five-eyed grabbers was pretty obvious though. Leanchoilia was what scientists politely call good prey. Translation, other things like to eat it, a lot. But for a while there, this little whip-armed weirdo was making it work in the dimming waters, where most creatures were starting to struggle with the whole seeing stuff problem. And speaking of things that like to eat other creatures, Sidneyia inexpectans looked at all these delicate little creatures with their fancy eyes and whip arms and thought, you know what this seafloor needs? A 16-centimeter killing machine that specializes in cracking shells. This thing was built for one job: take creatures with hard protective shells and turn them into bite-sized pieces. How? Well, Sidneyia had basically turned its legs into a set of meat grinders. The base of each front leg was covered in sharp, heavy spines that all pointed toward its mouth. Walk over something with a shell, and those spiny leg bases would converge and just demolish whatever was underneath. We know this worked because scientists found Sidneyia fossils with their stomachs still full of crushed up trilobites and other shelled creatures, which just completely pulverized, which means this thing was basically walking around the seafloor like some kind of mobile food processor, turning everything crunchy into edible paste. The really wild part is how common Sidneyia was. This wasn't some rare super predator that only showed up occasionally. This was everyday life on the Cambrian seafloor. Just 16-centimeter death machines casually strolling around, looking for things to step on and grind up. And here's what gets me about this whole situation. All those defensive strategies we've talked about already, the spikes, the whip arms, the multiple eyes, none of that helped against Sidneyia. It didn't need to see you coming or grab you with fancy appendages. It just needed to walk over you. And boom, it was dinner time. For the smaller creatures down there, Sidneyia was basically the end of the conversation. You could have all the spikes and eyes and whip arms that you wanted, but if one of these things decided you looked tasty, your evolutionary strategy suddenly didn't matter much anymore. But other places in the ocean were getting even worse than where these creatures resided. Because down in the deeper waters off what's now Greenland, where the oxygen was running low and water was getting properly toxic, evolution decided to get creative, really creative. Enter a 55-centimeter nightmare that somehow thought the best survival strategy was to become a giant filter feeder with the arms of a serial killer. Pambdelurion. Pambdelurion had 11 pairs of swimming flaps and 11 pairs of stubby walking legs, which already sounds excessive, but then you get to the front end. Two massive grasping arms covered in comb-like spines that could probably grab onto just about anything. The mouth situation was even more disturbing. A giant circular opening lined with rings of teeth that looked exactly like some other mystery creature scientists still can't even identify yet. Now, here's where it gets weird. With all this terrifying hardware, the whole setup worked though, because Pambdelurion was living in water that was basically poison. Low oxygen, high toxicity, the kind of environment where most creatures would just give up and die. But not our boy here. He just kept swimming around with his terrifying arms, politely filtering microscopic food particles while looking like he could tear apart anything that bothered him. Being the biggest thing in your neighborhood probably helped the whole survival situation. When you're 55 centimeters long and everything else is tiny, even the most aggressive predators might think twice about picking a fight, especially when those filter feeding arms looked like they could double as weapons pretty easily. But lurking in the same toxic waters, there was another creature taking a different nightmare approach. While Pambdelurion was out there being a polite, gentle filter feeder, its neighbor, Kerygmachela kierkegaardi, that's a very hard name to say, took the opposite approach. Same toxic Greenland waters, same low oxygen nightmare environment. But Kerygmachela looked at those conditions and decided, you know what? I'm gonna be the thing that makes this place even more dangerous. 24 centimeters of pure swimming predator. No walking legs at all, just 11 pairs of flaps for moving through the water and two absolutely massive pincer arms that curved outward from its head. The inside edges of those arms were lined with long, sharp spines, which were perfect for impaling whatever looked edible that day. Kerygmachela had compound eyes, which means it could actually see what it was hunting, and a small mouth positioned right between those giant claws. The whole design screams, I hunt things, and I'm good at it. It had none of that filter feeding nonsense. This was a pure predator. What I find fascinating is that both creatures were living in the exact same toxic waste dump of an ocean, but they went in completely different directions with their survival strategies. Pambdelurion became a gentle giant that happened to look terrifying. Kerygmachela actually was terrifying and used every bit of its scary equipment exactly as intended. The water was so bad in this area that most life couldn't survive there at all, but somehow these two monsters were not only making it work, they were thriving. But now let's fast forward millions of years to an even worse situation in the ocean. You know how sometimes you survive a massive global catastrophe and think, well, at least things can't get any worse. Well, Promissum lived through a worldwide ice age, watched most life on Earth die off, and then decided the perfect place to set up shop was in a toxic, oxygen-free nightmare pit that would kill basically anything else that tried to swim there. This 40-centimeter eel-shaped monster was living in what scientists politely call anoxic water, which is a fancy way of saying poison soup that smells like rotten eggs. This is the kind of water that kills fish just by existing near them. And Promissum was out there thriving, cruising around in what can only be described as the most over-engineered mouth in prehistoric history. It had 19 different types of teeth. 19. Some for grabbing, some for cutting, and some for crushing. The whole setup was arranged in this complex dental battery that could basically process any kind of food that managed to survive in the toxic waste dump they called home, which, let's be honest, probably wasn't much. The best part about Promissum is that it was absolutely massive for its type of creature. Most conodonts were microscopic little things that you need a magnifier to see properly, but not our boy here. He decided that if you're going to live in post-apocalyptic poison water, you might as well do it in style. It was 40 centimeters of pure I survived the ice age, and all I got was this toxic hellscape energy. Being the biggest predator in an environment where nothing else wanted to live was probably a pretty good move. No competition, plenty of space, and the only downside was having to breathe water that would dissolve most creatures on contact. You know, it's a small price to pay for being the king of the poison ocean. But even that wasn't the worst place to be a predator. Deep in the toxic Hunstruck Basin, where the water was so loaded with hydrogen sulfide that it could preserve dead things in perfect detail, something was hiding that absolutely should not have been there. A 10-centimeter reminder that evolution sometimes keeps its failed experiments running in the worst possible places. Schinderhannes bartelsi was what you'd call a living fossil, except it wasn't living anymore when scientists found it. It belonged to a group of apex predators that everyone thought had gone extinct 60 million years earlier. Turns out they've been wrong. Dead wrong. These radiodonts were the original Cambrian nightmare predators. Big compound eyes, circular mouths lined with teeth, and most importantly, those signature raptorial arms covered in spines for grabbing prey. The whole group was supposed to be ancient history by the Devonian period, but apparently nobody told Schinderhannes that. Instead of going extinct with dignity, this little survivor found the most hostile marine environment on the planet and decided to call it home. The water was so toxic that most creatures couldn't survive there. It was so loaded with poison that it created perfect fossil preservation conditions, which when you think about it is kind of ironic. The environment that killed everything else is the same reason we know this thing existed at all. Schinderhannes was basically proof that if you're willing to live in a place toxic enough to kill everything else, you can hang on long past your expiration date. The downside is that you're living in water that's essentially liquid death. But hey, no competition for food. But even worse, the Devonian period decided to make things more interesting with black water. 2 meters of streamlined shark cruising through water that was basically liquid charcoal. Cladoselache had the misfortune of being one of the first really good sharks in an ocean that looked more like an oil spill than actual water. The Cleveland shale deposits where scientists found this guy are basically ancient black sludge that settled in deep, nasty basins where oxygen was more of a suggestion than a requirement. What's wild about Cladoselache is how normal it looks compared to everything else we've talked about so far. It had no weird eyes, no nightmare appendages, no ridiculous spikes, just a shark-shaped shark with a mouthful of sharp teeth at the front of its head instead of underneath. Revolutionary design, apparently. The teeth situation was pretty solid though. It had multiple rows of sharp, multi-pointed teeth designed for grabbing slippery fish and holding on tight. Scientists found some fossils with their last meals still in their stomachs. Turns out Cladoselache was actually pretty good at catching fast-moving prey, fish, eels, and other swimming things that thought it could get away. But here's the part that really gets me. This perfectly functional, well-designed predator was swimming around in water so gross and oxygen poor that most modern fish would die just by swimming through it. Black shale environments are basically the ocean's equivalent of a septic tank, and Cladoselache was out there living its best life. The real kicker though, even with all that predatory success, Cladoselache wasn't even close to being the scariest thing in the neighborhood. It shared those black waters with Dunkleosteus, a 10-meter armored fish that could basically bite a car in half. So much for being a successful apex predator. Sometimes there's always a bigger, more armored fish in the sea. But even Cladoselache would have been confused by what came next. Carboniferous sharks decided that normal teeth were for quitters and started getting experimental. Really experimental. Edestus took one look at regular shark teeth and said, what if I just had 2 giant curved saws sticking out of my mouth instead? 6.7 meters of shark with a dental situation that defied all logic. Instead of rows of teeth in its jaws, Edestus had single curved blades of serrated teeth growing from the middle of both its upper and lower jaws. Just 2 big tooth saws projecting forward, constantly growing new teeth from the back and pushing the old ones to the front. Scientists spent years trying to figure out how this mouth was supposed to work. The whole setup looked more like a medieval torture device than functional feeding equipment. Some thought it worked with a scissor motion, but the curves were all wrong for that. Others suggested it thrashed its head around using the projected blades to slash prey to death, which honestly sounds about right for something living in the deep carboniferous oceans. The really crazy part is that this design was apparently successful enough to spread all over the northern hemisphere. Multiple species living for millions of years, all with these ridiculous mouth saws. Evolution doesn't usually reward completely stupid ideas, so somehow this nightmare dental work was actually effective. Edestus was cruising around marine black shales that formed when sea levels rose and covered everything in deep, dark water. This is the kind of environment where normal rules didn't seem to apply, and creatures could get away with the most ridiculous anatomical features imaginable. 2 giant curved tooth saws projecting from your mouth? Sure, why not? Nothing about this ocean made sense anyway, so who cares? But some creatures decided to play the long game instead. While other sharks were busy attaching lawnmowers to their mouths, Fadenia just focused on not dying, which was a smart strategy considering what was coming. The end. Permian extinction, also known as the Great Dying, wiped out 90% of everything that had ever lived in the ocean. Most creatures became fossils. Fadenia became a success story. 1.5 meters long, swimming around deep shelf waters below where storms could reach. It had nothing fancy about its approach. It was just a regular shark-shaped predator doing regular shark things while the world literally ended around it. It had no weird teeth arrangements, no experimental body plans, no revolutionary feeding strategies, just survival. The Great Dying was essentially Earth hitting the reset button with a sledgehammer. Massive volcanic eruptions, toxic gases, climate change, ocean acidification, basically every possible way to kill marine life happening at once. Most lineages that had been successful for millions of years just vanished. Gone, done, extinct. We will never probably know about most of them. There are even more crazy looking creatures out there that we will never know because of extinction level events like this. But Fadenia kept swimming through the worst environmental disaster in planetary history, through waters turning acidic, through temperatures rising, through oxygen levels crashing. It just kept doing its regular predator routine in the deep water while everything else was busy dying. After the extinction, when the dust settled and life started trying to rebuild, Fadenia was still there with the same basic body plan, the same lifestyle, and the same deep shelf habitat. Evolution had thrown its worst tantrum ever, and Fadenia had basically shrugged it off. Now, this isn't the most exciting approach to surviving, but when 90% of your competition disappears, being boring starts looking pretty smart. But the Mesozoic period brought entirely new creatures and problems to solve. 15 meters of Triassic sea monster with eyes the size of dinner plates, cruising around an inland sea that connected to the biggest ocean Earth had ever seen. Shonisaurus had looked at the whole survive by being reasonable sized approach, decided that was for amateurs. These massive eyes weren't there just to look scary. When you're an air-breathing reptile that needs to dive deep into completely dark water to find food, vision becomes pretty important. The bigger the eye, the more light you can gather, and Shonisaurus needed all the help it could get down in the depths where sunlight was just a memory. We know these giants were serious about their deep water lifestyle because dozens of them ended up fossilized together in what used to be a deep ocean basin. This wasn't a shallow lagoon where they got stranded, not a beach where they got washed up. It was deep water, far from shore, where only something built for diving would choose to spend time. The fossil site in Nevada is basically an ancient maternity ward. Adult skeletons mixed with newborn remains, but no juveniles. Scientists think Shonisaurus females would swim hundreds of miles out into the deep ocean to give birth, keeping their babies away from the predators that hunted in shallower waters. Yes, 15-meter marine reptiles commuting to offshore birthing grounds in pitch-black deep water. The Triassic oceans had officially entered the Age of Giants, and Shonisaurus was leading the charge into deeper, darker territory than anything before it had explored. Being the biggest thing in your neighborhood was one survival strategy, but now evolution was asking a different question. What if we made them so big that nothing else would even compete? But meanwhile, in France, something was redefining deep water hunting. 10 centimeters of Jurassic nightmare that makes the modern vampire squid look like it gave up on life entirely. You know that weird deep sea creature that drifts around eating garbage and looking depressed? Well, its ancestor was basically the complete opposite of that. Vampyronassa had 8 arms covered in powerful suckers, just waiting to grab onto whatever looked edible in the deep waters off what's now France. 2 of those arms were extra thick and muscular, designed specifically for wrestling with prey that didn't want to become dinner. It did none of this passive drifting around collecting scraps nonsense that the modern version does. This is over 200 meters down in the upper Baffle zone, where the water was dark enough that most creatures had given up on the whole seeing things approach to life. But Vampyronassa was out there actively hunting, using those specialized arms to snatch fish and crustaceans and whatever else was unfortunate enough to swim within grabbing distance. The really depressing part is comparing this to what vampire squids do today. Modern ones just hang around in oxygen minimum zones, occasionally extending a sticky thread to collect marine snow. Marine snow, by the way, is basically underwater dandruff mixed with dead stuff falling from above. Yes, that is their career now. Vampyronassa was living the high-energy predator lifestyle in toxic, low-oxygen French waters that would kill most modern sea creatures just from swimming through them. Fast forward today, and its descendants have basically become the ocean's unemployed cousin, sitting in even worse water conditions and surviving on scraps. Yes, evolution took a perfectly functional squid predator and turned it into something that eats garbage for a living. Sometimes progress doesn't really look like progress, but this is what survives, and that's the beauty of evolution. But at the same time, the Cretaceous had other ideas about evolution, specifically about neck lengths. 11.6 meters of Cretaceous plesiosaur that had decided its key to successful predation was having a neck so long it bordered on architectural engineering. Thalassomedon's neck was almost 6 meters by itself, which means more than half of this creature was just neck. Just think about that for a second. It had 62 vertebrae holding up a relatively tiny head with sharp conical teeth, all attached to a body with flippers that could push this whole setup through the water fast enough to hunt efficiently. The Western Interior Seaway was basically this thing's personal hunting ground, and it had figured out the perfect strategy for using all of that neck. Lurk in the dark, deeper water, keep that massive body hidden, and use the neck to strike upward at prey swimming near the surface. Fish would see this small head appearing from below and think, oh, that's not so bad, right up until they realized that small head was connected to 6 meters of neck attached to the body the size of a school bus. The biomechanics of this whole setup was actually pretty clever. That neck wasn't flexible enough to wave around dramatically. It was built more for precise, powerful strikes. The Thalassomedon would position itself below schools of fish, wait for the right moment, and dive that head upward with enough force to grab whatever looked tasty. For most of its existence, being the size of a small building with a ridiculous neck was a winning strategy, at least until the mosasaurs showed up and decided that even 11-meter sea monsters could become prey if you were big enough and hungry enough. The evolution's arms race never really ends. There's always something bigger waiting in the water to ruin your day. Which brings us to the Cretaceous, which saved the worst for the last. 1.5 meters of pure nightmare fuel that looked exactly what you'd expect from something that evolved to hunt in the deepest, darkest parts of the ocean. 6-centimeter fangs jutting out of its jaws, massive eyes designed to spot prey in water where sunlight had given up entirely, and a torpedo-shaped body built for high-speed ambush attacks. Enchodus had basically perfected the art of being a terrifying deep-sea predator. Those interlocking fangs could grab onto anything slippery and hold it while the victim figured out just how badly their day was about to go. Their eyes were also big enough to gather every photon of light that meant managed to filter down to the Mesopelagic zone, where most creatures had long since stopped bothering with vision. This was it, the final form of prehistoric deepwater horror, a global predator that had colonized every ocean on the planet during the late Cretaceous, perfectly adapted for hunting in conditions that would kill most modern fish just from the water pressure alone. And yet, despite being essentially a swimming set of kitchen knives with eyes, Enchodus spent most of its time being eaten. Mosasaurs, plesiosaurs, bigger fish, sharks, even diving seabirds. Everybody was snacking on Enchodus. Scientists find the remains in the stomachs of basically every large Cretaceous predator that's ever been discovered. So after this entire journey through 500 million years of increasingly horrific deep-sea creatures, we end up with the ultimate irony. One of the most perfectly designed deep-water predators in prehistoric history was also everyone's favorite item on the menu. Yes, this thing was the equivalent of prehistoric fish sticks. We focused on some of the more crazier looking ones in this video, but let me know other prehistoric sea creatures or other prehistoric creatures you'd like me to talk about in future videos. And if you enjoyed watching this video, make sure to give it a like and subscribe to the channel for more content just like this. Make sure to click the video on screen now.